Hello and welcome to this E-session, which I will be E-facilitating, whatever that might mean. My name is Dan Neale, I'm a Group Analyst and a Child Psychotherapeutic Counsellor. This is a session on supervision groups and reflective practice groups, and we're going to be looking at them from a group analytic perspective. The material in this presentation is largely taken from a book by Kennard and Hartley called Staff Support Groups in the Helping Professions, and almost all of the material will be taken from Chapter 1, what staff support groups are for, and then Chapter 5, the role in a facilitator. Where I make reference to other texts, I'll put references on the slides, and there'll also be a list of references at the end. So, staff support groups. As the first chapter says, these are generally for staff who are working closely together under conditions of some stress. And the following are different aspects of why they might be set up, given that lots of people work in stressful situations and not every setting will have staff support groups. So what are the benefits of setting up a staff support group? Well, first, it's to promote the value and the practice of open communication. And as it says, you'd be hard pressed to find anyone, particularly in our field of work, who would suggest that open communication is a bad thing in theory. And yet the reality is that often, particularly within institutions of any great size, there are real difficulties around communication. Now, some of those difficulties might be practical, like a lack of time, a lack of contact, having too much information to convey, things like that. Some of them might be located very much within an individual, thinking about the idea of location of disturbance might be a particular problem for an individual in communicating something, but more likely it'll be wider than that. So it might be between individuals, there might be a personality clash or a difference of style or a feeling of being slighted on one part or the other, which might cause problems. Or of course there might be difficulties within the whole team as a whole. So these could be things like low morale or feeling undervalued. And then we have the idea that it provides a protected time and space in which staff can get support from colleagues and learn from each other. So we might be able to share some of the difficulties, not feel quite so alone, finding out that other people maybe have actually struggled in similar ways to ourselves, and also to kind of give each other suggestions for how we might work more effectively. Thirdly, they should improve staff well-being in ways that are associated with better patient care and smoother unit functioning. Notice I've put some particular parts there in italics myself. And the point about this being that I really want to focus on this, and it's something that for anyone who's run these groups or maybe been in this type of group, will have some experience of maybe where a group might start to move towards more of a sort of therapeutic group, which might have an unconscious aim of improving staff well-being, but not particularly with regard to their work, just in the kind of general sense for themselves. Whereas the focus, particularly the facilitator, always has to have in mind is that what are we actually doing here, which will help ultimately with our goal of better patient care. Then we have enabling staff to express, discuss and manage difficult or painful emotional responses to people and situations in their work. Again, I've obviously highlighted that for very similar reasons. It's about actually the things that are going on at work. Now we're starting to get into maybe slightly deeper things, enabling staff to use the full range of their emotional responses in the service and the task. And I suppose particularly when we're working in some sort of psychodynamic field, whether explicit or implicit, we're thinking about things like countertransference and projective identification. So their kind of emotional responses get stirred up in us, not just finding a way to alleviate them. They're often painful, so they need some support or alleviation with them. But also, can they actually be used? Are they information in some way that can actually help us with our task? And then we have creating an environment in which the vulnerable parts of ourselves can be responded to and understood. Of course, very often we're working with people who themselves are vulnerable, and this will then touch on our own vulnerability. And of course, it's often talked about in the field about how each of us may well have got our own unconscious reasons, often related to vulnerabilities that we maybe haven't fully worked through, which might have brought us into this work in the first place. So they're just kind of sitting there ready and waiting to be reactivated by the nature of our work. And also to enable the team to discuss obstacles to team working that may arise from issues between individuals, within the team as a whole, or between the team and the wider organisation. So again, that idea of location of disturbance, where is the problematic blockage with communication or discussion, for example, can these groups help us identify those things and then work through them? Because if you think back to some of those examples I was giving before about how it could be a number of different levels, it's very easy for people to get stuck believing the problem is in one place, where in fact maybe it's a more diffuse, wider problem, and therefore needs to be thought about in a different sort of way. In terms of the aims of setting up a group, there can often be three levels that it can be helpful to think about. The first is the overt reasons. So, if a group hasn't always been running, it means that most of my work is in a therapeutic community. A former staff support group called Dynamics is set up right from the start as part of the structure, but in a lot of situations the institution is already running, and then they decide, which means someone or some subgroup decides that they need a staff support group, and then they've got to find someone and all of that. And so they'll obviously need to be funding needs and so on to pay for this, staff time and all of those things. So they'll obviously have to give an overt reason, and it might be something like, we have identified poor staff communication, we aim to improve staff communication by this, and they could actually be quite open with the staff group about the fact that this is their purpose. So that would be overt. And then there might be something more covert, like there might be, even in the same situation, they might say that, but also they think that it all stems from one difficult team member, for example, and actually the covert reason for the staff support group is finding somehow some sort of leverage to get rid of this person, or maybe at least to bring them back into line. Or there could be other things, like they might be trying to sort of push through some difficult change, and so they brought in a staff support group to help with that, but they're not actually sharing that with the rest of the staff team who are going to be in the group, and it may well be they haven't even shared it with the facilitator. And then of course there'll also be unconscious reasons that they themselves won't know, and those will remain for the group and the facilitator, hopefully in the life of the group, to discover what those might be. So your course is probably mainly focused on therapy groups, so it's natural to ask ourselves at this point, so do these three levels operate in the case of therapy groups? Obviously I'm asking the question because I think the answer is yes. I'm not talking here about the aims and the facilitator in setting them up, I suppose. I'm more talking about the aims with which individuals come to a therapy group, whether that's referring themselves directly or their GP refers them or whatever. So an example, an overt reason might be that someone comes along and they tell the assessor they're drinking too much, maybe they're overeating, they're having problems at work, they're having problems with their partner. They share these things with the assessor, and if they're not too embarrassed or ashamed, they might then share those kind of things with the group quite early on. This is the presenting problem, and they're consciously aware of it, and they might feel able to share it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's right at the root of the problem, but from their point of view, that is the problem. A more covert reason in therapy might be something like maybe their partner has made it a condition of them staying together. You need help, you need to go and get therapy, otherwise I'm leaving you, something like that, which they might not share with the assessor, they might not share with the therapy group, because actually they're kind of aware that if they do that, they'll be challenged on the fact that they're not really here with a good motivation. In fact, maybe they're doing it really to tick a box, say, look, I've done what you asked, aren't I good? I'm trying, rather than actually really to work at any sort of personal development. So that's more likely to be something that someone might keep to themselves. So it'd be covert. They're consciously aware of it, but it'd be covert. And then, of course, inevitably there'll be unconscious reasons as well. So similarly, a person might not be fully aware that they've actually come to a therapy group hoping for affirmation. They've come saying, I've got these problems I want to change. But actually, once they start to get into therapy, you can see that what they're really doing is hoping that the therapy group is going to exonerate them. They're going to act like a jury and weigh up the evidence. Say, actually, no, you're right all along. It's your partner's fault. It's not you. You don't need to change. It's everyone else. It's your boss's fault. It's your dad's fault. It's your cat's fault. Whatever the, but that wouldn't necessarily be, I mean, it could be a conscious reason, I suppose, but it might not be a reason that someone consciously comes to therapy. Why would you go through all that time and money just to get that? So in a therapy group, of course, there'll be these kind of unconscious reasons too, and it's no different, except on a different level with a staff support group. The staff support groups cover a whole range of different types of group, and of course in this session we're focusing on two particular types: supervision groups and reflective practice groups. So what is a supervision group? Okay, well, supervision is sometimes regarded as having three dimensions. There's a formative or educational aspect, there's a normative or managerial, so kind of like a quality control aspect, and then there's a restorative or supportive aspect. Not everyone uses this model, but it's quite a popular sort of model. You can find it, for example, in Hawkins and Showett's book, which is called Supervision in the Helping Professions. So you're going to expect some degree of overlap with a staff support group because of these aspects. All of these are going to be relevant to a staff support group. But there's also quite a lot of difference. In particular, we can think about three different types of supervision group. So in the first type, supervisees only come together for supervision. Remember, first of all, when we talk about staff support groups, they tend to be when staff are working closely together in stressful situations. So you might have a situation where supervisees are only coming together for supervision. If you're on the Turvey diploma, that's not quite the case because you're also probably in therapy together and in seminars together. But generally, you're not a staff team working in a particular environment. You come together for supervision. Some really experienced qualified group analysts might be in group supervision with an even more experienced supervisor. And the group members won't be working together. They might have just found a group that they feel is appropriate for their level of development and so on. So you can have these kind of situations which almost is like a therapy group in that sense, that at its most extreme form there might be no contact between supervisees outside for different reasons, but there might just not be that contact. So those issues about what happens between people, of course things might happen in the group, but there aren't going to be issues about the fact that someone used someone else's mug or their last tea bag or whatever in the staff office, because they're not working together in that kind of way. And then we have situations which are rife for people using a last tea bag. Supervisees work as a team but with different clients. So a really kind of classic example in our setup would be like in a counselling service. Maybe I supervised for a while in a charity counselling service. A lot of the supervisees were trainees. They would see each other in other settings too, but they were working at the same counselling service. They'd be using the same offices, the same toilets, the same kitchen, all of these sorts of things. If one therapist happened to have a really loud booming voice, it might be that it travels through the walls and someone else overhears them. They're not working with the same clients, or the overlap might be very small. So I've been in situations when the overlap's very small because maybe there's someone in the group who also works as an assessor. So you might have a situation where someone has assessed a client initially, and then that person becomes the client of someone else in the group, which obviously throws up interesting dynamics. But in general, everyone has their own caseload. This would even happen somewhere like the Group Therapy Centre in Cambridge, which is group work rather than individual work. But again, once people are assigned to groups, people are working in the same team, but not with the same clients because everyone has their own groups. And then we have an even more intimate situation when the supervisees are working as a team with the same clients. So you're all working in the same ward, for example, you're working in a care home, and of course my place of work, therapy to community. So you're working as a team, so you're still using, the same toilets and office and kitchen, and able to, get up each other's noses by stealing people's favourite parking spots or whatever. But actually, you're also working with the same clients, so there's some really powerful dynamics that could be going on there too. So for supervision groups would generally be much smaller than a standard sort of staff support group, and there'll be more focus on individual learning than in a standard staff support group, and they would usually be more structured. So I would imagine the groups that you would have at somewhere like Turvey would be like that. Certainly when I was running supervision groups, we'd have up to 4 supervisees in a supervision group, and we would share out the time. They would need to make decisions generally about which of their clients they would bring for supervision each time, but we would share out the time so everyone would get a piece of focused time for a client or more than one, if that was how they chose to use the time. There'd be a lot of focus on theory practice links, particularly if people are trainees. Of course, there'll be a lot of work on that, but the supervisor will try and bring out some of those links. And there may be an explicit agreement or contract for supervision, which may include assessment. So again, when I was doing that work, because most of them were trainees, I was writing reports twice a year, an interim one and an end of year report in terms of their development, in terms of clinical practice. And for the people who were already clinically qualified, I was again writing reports, slightly different ones, about their ongoing accreditation. So as well as supervising them, I'm also assessing them at the same time. You wouldn't expect that with a standard staff support group or reflective practice group, really. It might be their main or only form of supervision for this work. When I was training, I was running my training group in the group therapy centre, and I had supervision there. So there I was having supervision where I was part of a team, but working with different clients because we each had our own therapy group, of course. But I was also having supervision at Turvey, where it was more like the first case, where apart from the other bits and pieces of being at Turvey, generally we weren't a team in that sense. We weren't working together, so it was having 2 different types of supervision. But for the people I was supervising when I was working at the Heart and Beds Counselling Foundation, mine was the only form of supervision they would be having, weekly supervision, but that was the only form of supervision they would be having for that work. You wouldn't expect a staff support group to do that. You wouldn't expect a staff support group to be your only form of supervision. You'd expect, at the very least, some sort of line management supervision going alongside it, and hopefully some clinical supervision if the work's at all deep. And the group might need to reflect the different supervisees at different levels, and that can actually be a really helpful sort of thing. But in terms of what's expected of people, people will be at different levels. Okay, so I'm going to give you my group analytic formulation of supervising in groups. For me, I feel that this is a really natural way of thinking about it, thinking about psychodynamic work, thinking about supervision, and thinking about it in a group analytic way. And yet I've never seen it written explicitly like this or really discussed like this. So if you do find it written about anywhere, please tell me. And if you do, you will of course induce a really bittersweet response in me, a real delight that obviously I'm not completely crazy and other people are thinking along those lines. And of course the bitter resentful part is about the fact that here was I thinking I'm some sort of pioneering trailblazer for this, and actually it's kind of old hat. But in psychodynamic work, our most important tool is what? I'm hoping you're kind of screaming it at the screen now, even though I can't hear. Well, I would say it's ourselves. Put in slightly less flowery, more technical language, it's our countertransferences. That's what we mean by ourselves in this particular case. And pretty much ever since Hyman wrote that seminal paper in 1950, whenever it was, about the importance and the countertransference, where this revolution of seeing it not as just being about not having been analysed enough, but actually our most important tool for understanding the unconscious of someone else. But this thing is not just kind of given to us or not. So some, people are either natural therapists or not. It can actually be calibrated, and it has to be calibrated through our training, and of course ongoing afterwards, but through our training. So, through our personal therapy and also through our supervision. And by calibrating it, we get an ever deepening level of sensitivity. Obviously, I've chosen that phrase partly to echo Fuchs's famous statement about ever deepening communication. But that's what I'm talking about. Ever deepening sensitivity to these slight nuances that could so easily be missed or ignored in our countertransference, to be able to be responsive to a much wider range of countertransference than maybe we were at the start of our training. And a supervision group, rather than just an individual relationship, is a particularly powerful way of doing this. Why? Why is it so powerful? Well, for me, what makes it so powerful is, of course, you've got other people in there. So you have a possibility of seeing different responses. The danger with, obviously when you've got an individual supervisor, you've got someone who can give a different response to the client's material than yours, and that's helpful. And of course they'll be more experienced, so it's helpful in that way. But of course they're very much sort of an expert in that sense. They might not literally be an expert, but it's very easy to see them in that sense, and therefore feel that their countertransference was right and yours wasn't. Whereas by having a group, you get a possibility of having several different responses, all of which might have some validity in the inner world of the client, in the sort of the inner group of the client. Much harder for any one individual to pick that up. So it's really, really powerful way of doing that. And for this reason, actually, a supervision group isn't just sort of like a compromise because maybe there isn't enough time or it would cost too much to have individual supervision. It can actually in many ways have advantages, in the same way a therapy group can have advantages over individual therapy, and it's not just a second best. Sometimes it can be even better because of what's available through that route. So it follows from this that what I want my supervisees when I'm supervising to gain is a deeper, wider and a more sensitive ability to use their countertransference through having their awareness sort of raised by the group, because other people say things that you wouldn't have picked up. And then you think, oh, that's interesting, and then you start to think, well, why would I not have picked it? Why, it's very easy when it's this expert to think, oh, well, of course, they've been doing it for years, so they would pick up on it. But when someone else who's been doing it just as long as you, they pick up on something different. It's not that they're better or worse than you, but they've picked up on something different. They've only been doing it 18 months. So then it kind of raises the question more pertinently. So why were they tuned into that part of the projection, whereas I was tuned into this other part? Really interesting, really rich area. So what I'm hoping is they're going to internalize a supervision group rather than internalize me. Caseman talks about an internal supervisor, and I think that's really important. But here it's actually the supervisor. It's not my voice I want them to hear necessarily next time they're in a session. I want them to hear the group. So I want them to hear a conversation, not just a single voice, not just a monologue of me. I want them to hear those different voices, almost like an author who can hear several characters talking to each other at once. I want the supervisees to be moving towards that. So they, they're with a client and they're thinking, well, but actually, if this was Fred rather than me who was here, what would they be picking up on? And what would Sally be picking up on? And then what would Fred say to Sally, or Sally say to Fred about what they've picked up on? That's the kind of thing I want them to internalise. Have I just done myself out of a job here? Well, I hope not, because my job is to attend to the group as a whole, making sure that what they're internalising is as healthy, creative and nuanced as it can be, because that's the thing they're going to be internalising and taking with them. And of course, sometimes that might mean me actually just sharing my countertransference, or a bit of theory, or a link between theory and practice, or an example of an intervention they kind of made, some quite some basic stuff, particularly with newer supervisors. I might need to put some of those things in. I'm not going to completely withhold from that, but by and large, it's the health of the group that I'm hoping to expand, because that's what I want them to be internalising. It's a very similar thing. This is why I think it's so natural to what the group analyst is doing, actually. That Fuchs talks a lot about refraining from interpretations and not getting sucked in by the group, pushed in by whatever's going on in the back of our own heads, into being the expert and making interpretations and being the authority. You're attending to the group and then letting the group do those things for itself, and that's what a group analytics supervisor should be doing, I think. You know, obviously I'm now largely to blame for the fact the paper hasn't been written on this, because I'm saying I've had this idea. Shouldn't we all be doing this? Maybe some of you will find it written somewhere else. Okay, so with that in mind, we have some scenarios. Obviously, if you're doing this on your own, you're on your own. But hopefully there will be a time where we can get together, even if that's only through the internet, and discuss these, you know, maybe as a group with peers, and then we'll all come together and discuss them. So I've got a few scenarios here. I'm not going to bother reading through them because you've got it on the PowerPoint, or I might even send them out separately. Okay, so reflective practice groups now. Think about that. Now, so a reflective practice group might well not be as clearly different from a staff support group as a supervision group is. And any differences there are might be more to do with the different style of facilitator than the title. Reflective practice itself is a process whereby the practitioner stops to think about their practice, consciously analyses their decision-making process, and then relates the theory to what they do in practice. That's really what it means to be a reflective practitioner. And this can be done in many ways, but when you do it in a group, it brings a new dimension up. Sorry if you're a bit fed up now with me going on about groups bringing a new dimension, but then on the other hand, you know, what did you expect? You come on a course in group analysis. I'm going to be talking about groups bringing a new dimension. So reflective practice groups are therefore groups where one of the main aims of the facilitator is to find ways to encourage reflective practice. Of course, that's a group. So what is the role of a facilitator? Well, this is chapter 5 now, sets out various things, sort of broad components, early sessions, boundary maintenance, task maintenance, types of intervention you might make, how you work with feelings in the group, and surviving. So we're going to look at those in turn. So, broad components. There's much similarity here with therapy, especially a Rogerian approach, a person-centered approach. And there's also a lot of similarity with Yalom, mutatis mutandis, with the necessary changes having been made. So Yalom wrote a very famous book on group psychotherapy. He's not a group analyst, he was a group psychotherapist. And one of the things he's particularly well known for is having listed what he thinks are the therapeutic factors in groups. And we can think about these therapeutic factors, and these are the ones I'm suggesting we take, but we just kind of change them a bit for the setting. So, for example, something like self-disclosure, which before would have been the act of revealing personal information to the group, now becomes the act of revealing personal information as regards one's practice to the group. Remember what I was talking about right at the start with staff support groups, and this idea of always need to come back to the practice, you know. So the fact that you woke up this morning and you had diarrhea, is that relevant to your practice? You know, why are you revealing that personal information, say? Of course, you know, thinking psychodynamically, thinking unconsciously, there's always going to be a reason. You know, things are always determined by the unconscious. So whatever someone says in a group, there will be some link. I suppose it's more about the facilitator finding some way of making that link. You know, someone's bike was vandalized the night before, they start in a group with that. It's not clear how it links to their work. Maybe it just links because it was hard for them to get to work. But maybe there's something more, something about, damage, about violence, about being impinged upon, or whatever it is. But the aim of the facilitator is to try and bring out these things, these links, but how they link to practice. So again, the example of the person whose bike was vandalized, it made it hard for them to get to work. Might be all sorts of things linked to their own experience of damage from their childhood, say. But those are not the kind of things that the facilitator's trying to bring out here. They're trying to bring out a link maybe with, you know, the damage in the clients, the possibility of the clients damaging us, the possibility of us damaging the clients, that sort of thing. So the focus again back on it as regards the work. They should also add a genuine interest in the experiences of staff and real respect for the efforts the staff are making to carry out difficult tasks. I can't stress that enough. It's really important that they're interested in those things. And again, this is a danger, I suppose, coming from the sort of therapeutic thing where, you know, details can so often be seen as a bit of a sort of defense, a screen, you know. So if you're in a therapy group and you're talking a lot about the details required to make a loaf of bread, you might be wondering about, well, what am I doing here, you know, kind of keeping the group at a distance in some way. Whereas actually, if you've been called in to run a staff support group for bakers, I mean, not quite sure why you would, but let's go with that example for now. You've been called in to run that, then actually, you know, this is reflective practice on baking, and you're not a baker yourself, you're a group analyst. So you need to start with that genuine interest in actually what is it like to come in every day at 3 in the morning and have to put your fingers into dough, all of these sorts of things. It's not a defence, because that is the work. That's where we start from here. Okay, what about the early sessions then? Well, obviously it's really important to reduce anxiety. Lots of people won't be necessarily very happy about being there. There's all sorts of anxieties that will probably be floating around, including ones for you. And then you need to help members to talk, but it's very important they don't talk too much or too deeply at first. I mean, this is actually the same in analytic groups, isn't it? That we all have seen situations where someone's come in, maybe dumped a load of stuff and then ran. Maybe unconsciously that was always the plan, or maybe they felt too exposed or whatever, and then the group feels a bit abused by having stuff dumped on them, or it's really hard then for, well, the person stays in the group, then other people find it hard to disclose because their things feel minor in comparison, all of those kind of things. So we would want to try and mitigate against this. But in a reflective practice group, this is also really important because different people will be at different stages, different people will be ready to talk about different sorts of things. So it suggests, you know, facilitating comments, you know, might be things like someone brings something up and you say, you know, what do other people think? Or has that been other people's experience? You know, you're trying to bring other people in, you know, rather than just kind of return to the person who's spoken and kind of question them, because of course that will inevitably lead to more from them. It becomes more of a sort of just a dialogue between the two of you. And then you also need to help the group to work on the agreed aims so it doesn't sort of drift away from those. These are all on pages 48 to 49. Okay, boundary maintenance. So you can get challenges from within. So, you know, early stages, people might come in late, they have to leave early, they allow themselves to be called out, they bring in their phone, which is on, or, you know, pager, maybe if they're on a ward or something, which they have on, and people page them. Some of these things, like being early and late and so on, are quite standard within therapy groups. Other things, like having their pager, which they need to be paged on, are much more likely to be happening in a reflective practice group, particularly because normally that will be happening in the work environment. You will have gone to them rather than them coming to you in your clinic or room or whatever, and so you're in that sort of natural environment, and so all of those urgencies of the day-to-day work can easily impinge on the group. It's really important that you kind of you're firm but tactful with this. You don't want it to come across as a criticism of the individual, even though it'll be probably expressed through an individual, you know, the individual whose phone has rung or has come late. What you need is not to raise people's anxiety, because it feels like if you step out of line you're being criticised. It's more about helping them understand why you're holding that boundary, what it is that you're doing by protecting that boundary from the group. And then you've also got the challenges from outside. So, you know, again, you're in their environment. You've been told you can use this room, but today there's a case conference, so you're going to have to go in a different room, or there aren't enough staff, so there's only going to be 2 or 3 when there should be 12, or maybe the whole group has to be cancelled because there aren't enough staff. So there are things which kind of impinge on the group from outside, and a large part of your work might be finding a way, again, to think about this, talk to the required people, and if at all possible, reduce it so that the group can be protected, so that safety and containment can flourish within the group for people to reflect ever more deeply on these sorts of things. What is this an example of? Well, really what we're talking about is dynamic administration, isn't it? All of those things that a group analyst does in setting up the group and then maintaining it, but with this added element that I've alluded to, which is that almost certainly, if it's a reflective practice group like this, it will be people in their work environment, so you're going into their environment, so you have even less control. I mean, I've known colleagues who struggle because they've set up a therapy group in an individual counselling centre. That's often been the way it's had to be, and even there they can be under attack because for some reason the counselling centre doesn't understand that they need to have that room all the time. Someone who was running a group in a church and there was a yoga group beforehand and they kept on overrunning and they couldn't set up, all of those sorts of things. But generally you'll have more control over the environment when it's clients and they're coming to you, but obviously in this setting you may well not. So it's much harder for you to insist that you really have to have that room, that they've now set up a load of people for a case conference. But you have to find some way of still trying to hold that kind of boundary, but it's still really part of that dynamic administration. It's just that things are harder. So obviously one of the things that then takes us back to is the idea that you need to set up the contract as carefully as you can with people in the first place, so you've got something to kind of go back to and remind whoever you had those initial negotiations with about what the agreement was about the room, the staff being made available, and so on. The nature of these environments is that they do have crises, and part of what you might develop is a sense of the different levels of crisis. Sometimes people talk about learning to understand the different cries of their baby. You know, that first of all, every cry sounds like it's an emergency, the baby's dying. And after a while, you start to realise there's 3 levels of urgency of crying or something like that. And in these kind of environments where there's a lot of firefighting, you might notice that with crisis, that every time you're there, there's a crisis. But some crises are the kind of crisis where the ward is actually burning down, and for you to run your reflective practice group whilst the walls are on fire is not good practice. But there's a whole series of other lower kind of crises, and at some point you need to find a way of, you know, sensibly pitching what kind of crisis can we manage and still run, and what kind of crisis do we not. The twist is the fact that you're not on home soil, you're playing away, and therefore you have these other vicissitudes that you still have to try and find some way to manage. Task maintenance. What comes under task maintenance? Well, support is needed to enable staff to face rather than to evade difficult issues. That's what a group is there for, really, to help people face these difficult issues. And so you might have options when you see that the group appears to be evading a difficult issue. The first one would be simply to wait and see. There's no need to jump in and immediately try and address it if the group is avoiding something. Another option would be to comment on the avoidance. So, for example, in the paper, they talk about a situation where maybe the startup group is taken up with a number of staff discussing a film that was on TV last night. And so you could comment on the fact that the group are maybe finding it hard to focus on the work in hand or something like that. But then a third option might be to comment on the unconscious communication. So if you take that example again, if you knew the film, or if you picked up just from the conversation something that you thought was actually an unconscious communication. So maybe there's something about the film plot that is relevant to some dynamic that is happening in the team at the moment. So you might draw that out. For those of you who read Milan's paper on defence mechanisms, he talks a lot about the fact that defences have a tendency to cover something up, but at the same time they also express it. So something like that would be an example of it, wouldn't it? You know, the collective group defence of avoiding the work by talking about a film, but at the very time they do it, they also reveal something about their preoccupation because they've chosen a film whose plot in some way mirrors what's happening. So those would be 3 possible ways that a facilitator might try and help the group think about the task. You might also want to compare and contrast the situation with what was described in such exquisite detail in Menzies-Lith's paper, Menzies 1959. There's a reference to it at the end of the slides. What about types of intervention? Well, the kind of types of intervention you want to avoid are things like being too detached, because staff might feel they're being judged. So you probably wouldn't be as detached as you would be being analytic in a therapy group. People will feel that you're kind of there as some sort of senior member of staff, but you don't, because you're an expert in the field, but you're not really engaging with them. They don't really know what you're quite doing there. They'll feel you're just kind of watching them and almost kind of, you're there, you're being silent, you're giving them enough rope to hang themselves. That's the kind of fantasy people might have. You don't want to be interpreting an individual's hidden or unconscious motives. I mean, probably you don't want to be doing that in therapy groups too much. Sometimes it needs doing. Fuchs talks about that, when the group has virtually got there, they just can't, and then you might want to nudge them over. But even then, he says, what you might actually want to do is analyse what's the blockage. If they've got that close and they still can't do that final step, what is the blockage? Not just in the individual, but for the group. So he even says that. But generally, in a setting like this, you really don't want to be doing that, because that's not the route you want to be. You don't want to be exposing people at work in that kind of way. You don't want to be kind of giving people therapy when you don't have a contract for that, and it might well detract from the rest of the group. You don't want people to be exposed in that way. You don't want people to feel that they can't share stuff about their practice, because once they share stuff about their practice, it's inevitably going to go into their sort of personal life or their personal history. And you don't want to increase the anxiety or the regression in the group. They've got to go out afterwards. They've got to carry on functioning. So you don't want them to be regressing. You also don't really want to encourage those exploration of personal fantasies about the facilitator. Maybe they come up, you need to work with them, of course. Like those, someone does actually say, I think you've just been sent by senior management to watch us, something like that. It's professionally related to the work or the organisational dynamics. So you want to explore that, but other things in the way that you might do when you're thinking about transference to the facilitator in a therapy group, you wouldn't necessarily explore those things or encourage those things to be explored in the same sort of way. Okay, we've talked a bit about the sorts of interventions you might want to avoid, but what interventions are you going to use then? Well, here are some that you might use, but in some cases you still want to make a careful judgment about when and even if to use them. Firstly, something like open questions. This is not normally it's not normally any danger associated with this. This is always a good route to go down, particularly if you're kind of not sure. So give simple examples. Facilitator may ask if anyone has anything they want to talk about, or if 2 or 3 people are discussing a particular issue, you might invite other people in by saying, I wonder if other people have any feelings about this. So quite basic sort of things, but it gets the group talking more. We also want to be encouraging empathy, because people might well be sharing stuff which makes them feel at least a little bit vulnerable, and we want to encourage that as part of the culture of the group. One of the things that can happen quite a lot is not that the group is consciously trying to be unempathic, but someone might say something, no one quite knows how to respond, and therefore effectively what they're met with is kind of a wall of silence, which can feel like people aren't interested or rejecting what's been said, even though actually it's more that their own anxiety about not knowing how best to respond. So a facilitator might help by saying something quite simple like that might have been really difficult for you, or they might invite other people in, saying, I wonder if other people have felt like this too. Asking for clarification or information, this is something that you can certainly do, and of course the reality is that it may well be that you're not running a group in an area which specialised in something which is also your specialty. So I sort of half flippantly mentioned this idea of the support group for bakers, but it may well be that you're coming in, you're running, I don't know, suppose you're running a support group for shift of firemen. You've never been a fireman. So there'll be all sorts of day-to-day details about the work, but they form the texture of these people's working lives, and might be really important that they have a chance to share those with you, and you understand something about, you know, what life is like for them. So you might just ask questions about, you know, well, what would normally happen in a situation like this, or how would this normally be managed, or what would the alternatives have been, so that you're, rather than you sort of suggesting things, that you're finding out from them how do things normally work here. Modelling, whether intended or not, everything a facilitator does in a group offers a model of how to behave. So if you show interest, if you're thoughtful, if you're empathic, all of those things model something for the group. And of course, if you don't do those things, you're modelling very much the opposite. Perhaps most useful of all is when the facilitator models a reflective, thoughtful attitude that tries to understand rather than pass judgment. Someone who ran dynamics groups that I was a member of for many years talked a lot about this. He talked a lot about it, you know, for our work too, and he particularly used that kind of classical Freudian model of the ego and the superego. That what you don't want to be in is that superego position of passing judgment and moralising. He was talking about our work with these rather delinquent children and young people, but of course the same applied for him to us, really. So you don't want to be in that superego place. You want to be in an ego place if you can. And something like curiosity and thoughtfulness, those are ego functions, not superego functions, and that's where you want to try to be, modelling as the facilitator, and hopefully that then other people will do that with each other in the group, but also outside as well. Now we're getting into areas which are more where I would say you need to think carefully about how you use them. So self-disclosure, always a difficult one. If in fact you are a specialist in that area, you were a fireman yourself, you know, and you're now running a support group of firemen, you want to be very careful maybe about what you disclose about your own experiences, because of how the group might take that. There's an example in the paper. There's one which works quite positively, and then there's one which is more problematic, where a bit like we were just talking about with that superego thing, where some staff were being quite sort of moralistic in the facilitator's eyes, and they tried to change the tone of conversation by self-disclosing a bit about their own experience of shoplifting as a teenager, something a lot of teenagers have done. But in fact, what actually happened was the group became very interested, curious, but not in the necessarily in the helpful, curious way, about finding about their own facilitators' delinquent past. So this was a case where maybe they'd misjudged it. And it then ends by saying, good general guide is the facilitator is aware of the aim in making a disclosure. So you need to sort of, you know, have almost a bit of internal supervision for yourself. You're thinking of making a self-disclosure before you do it. So why am I doing this? What is my aim? And is that beneficial for the group? Will it meet the needs in a group rather than meeting my own needs or wants? And then we have challenge or confrontation. This is something you should do very rarely. You certainly don't want to be doing it early in the life of a group, and probably wherever possible you want to be challenging the group rather than the individual. You don't want anyone personally to feel put on the spot. You'd probably only use it if you'd exhausted all other methods. So for example, if there was a lot of avoidance, you tried lots of other methods to get the group working, you might eventually feel that you need to actually kind of confront them with how much avoidance there is, but still with that sort of, you know, warmth and non-judgmentality as much as you can manage it, to invite them in to be curious as well, because you still want that curiosity. You don't want, you know, I'm the expert superego who's telling you you're doing it wrong, you're using these groups wrongly because you're avoiding. It's, you know, I'm going to give you this feedback, but from an ego position of what I can see, and I'm really curious about what it's about, and I hope you're going to be curious with me too on this. It says the group's response to a direct challenge is likely to depend on the degree of trust the facilitator has built up, which is one of the reasons you wouldn't want to be using it early on in the life of a group. Commenting on parallel group process. Parallel process refers to a close similarity between something happening in the group and events outside it, even when on the surface they seem unrelated. In fact, in my work, I would often talk about actually 4 levels of what we might see. Here I'm talking about, you know, troubled children who are looked after. So you would see parallels at least 4 levels. You see a parallel often in the original birth family. You then might see that paralleled when the child goes into foster care. We're working residentially with the children, and normally they've been through foster care and that hasn't worked before they come to us. So you have the birth family, you then have any previous placements, you then at the 3rd level you have what's actually happening here in the therapeutic community in general, and then the 4th one, even more specific, what's actually happening specifically in this group. So there's a parallel even between what happens when we go out there and we're on shift and we're getting the kids to brush their teeth and so on, and what actually happens in this hour and a quarter or a fortnight or whatever. So in that case it'd be at least 4 levels where you might see that parallel process. But here in the paper is particularly commenting on what happens out there on the ward on shift, what happens in here in this group. It's as near as the staff group facilitator might get to making an interpretation, and it can be helpful when approached in a tentative way and again focused on the team as a whole. And then the idea of a group as a seminar, not dangerous in the sense that it's sort of emotionally dangerous necessarily, but there's a danger that I suppose the group might really like it because it's a bit more sort of structured, it's a bit more dogmatic in some way, a bit more kind of conventional learning. So if you sort of move into a role where you're doing a bit more sort of teaching, you need to be quite careful again about, you know, why am I doing this? What are my actual aims? Is this in the group's best interest? And how am I going to help the group come back out to that, into that more unstructured discussion? But there may well be times when you know, it would be withholding to actually be sitting on a piece of, you know, a nugget of information in some way that could be quite useful. There might be something you actually know. On the other hand, there's also often a lot of knowledge and wisdom within the group, and it's a really interesting question about why is that not being mobilised. You know, someone's asking a question about something quite practical, and maybe there are people in the group who know. So why are they not saying? Why are they leaving it and hoping the facilitator would? What are the dynamics underlying that? So it's not just about the transmission of information, but about a dynamic again amongst the group. Okay, working with feelings. When you're working with feelings in the group, the key things to remember are these people may be working together the rest of the day. It's not like a therapy group where the people who are in the group, you know, are able to go outside. They all go their separate ways. If they need to go and get a cup of coffee or have a walk in the park, maybe they can. They've now got to go out and be in a different role with regard to chat. I mean, yes, they were colleagues in the room, but interrelating in a different sort of way. But now they've got to go out and they're going to be client facing, and particularly in those situations we're talking about, you know, those triadic situations, you know, 2 people, they've just been a reflective practice group together, and now they're going out and they're actually working together, you know, in the canteen, serving people on an inpatient ward or something. So they're actually together around the clients. So you've got to be really, really sensitive to that. And they might have to go out and be on shift immediately afterwards. So if they're going out and they're feeling very uncontained and emotionally all over the place, it could be really harmful for the clients and also for them. And then we have surviving. And this isn't just in Winnicott's sense, although of course that's really important. It's also the group that needs to survive, not just you. And it's got to survive at least until the appointed time for its end. And of course, this is also part of your dynamic administration, taking steps behind the scenes to ensure this happens. If it was set up as time limited, then that's obviously part of the contract in the first place. If it was set up that it was going to end at some point, but no one was quite clear, then you're thinking ahead to the end and starting to have those conversations early. You don't want, by any means, a situation where someone comes in from outside, someone, say senior or whatever, says, "Oh, right, we're going to need that room now, so you've got 2 more weeks and then we're done." You obviously don't want that sort of ending. You want to be thinking ahead so you can kind of prepare the group for the group to be ending. Okay, and then again, like we talked about with supervision, I've got various scenarios. I'm not going to read through them. Have a look at them on your own, and then hopefully we'll have a scope to get together in small groups and discuss them, and then the whole group together. Okay, and finally, for good practice, as if you're writing essays or whatever, I myself have shown where I've had my ideas from. So it's mainly the 2 chapters from Kennard and Hartley. I go with an alphabetical approach. So although Kennard and Hartley are the main ones, they haven't come first because there was a brief reference to Hawkins and Showit on supervision. And then there was also briefly a mention of Menzies-Lith, who wrote this very famous, really, really wonderful paper. One of my favourite papers of all time. Do read it if you get a chance. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that the fact that you're watching this means that at some point we're also going to get to see each other, quite possibly online, but we'll be able to get back together as a group and discuss some of these ideas here and how we might apply them, particularly through those scenarios. But if you've got your own scenarios, if you've been in these kind of groups, or maybe you're even facilitating a group like this, that would be great to hear about too. Okay, thank you. Congratulations. Due to your tenacity at getting to the end of this e-session, I have actually got a bonus question for you, in addition to all of those other scenarios that we've seen through the session. This is specifically about a staff support group. So you've been invited in, or you've answered an advert, to run a staff support group for one wing of a prison. So the staff you're working with are going to be 10 officers who work exclusively on that wing. By and large, they work in 2 shifts of 5. Above them, you've got a senior officer, an SO, who also works exclusively on that wing and is their line manager. And then above the SO, there is a governor who will actually be in charge of 2 or 3 wings. So the group hasn't started yet, and you're in discussion with the SO because you need the SO's authority to have a room, to have staff made available, even to have doors unlocked physically to get in. So you're doing that dynamic administration and setting up the group. And towards the end of your meeting with the SO, he says to you that neither he nor his boss, the governor, will actually be attending the staff support group. So you quite curiously ask what the reasoning is behind that. And the SO says that they're both very sensitive to the fact that his role is mainly a managerial role, involves mainly paperwork. He's not confronted day to day with that challenging behaviour from the prisoners on the wing. And this is a staff support group, and therefore what's really important is that the staff who are confronted with that sort of really difficult behaviour get the support they need, and neither he nor his boss want to be taking away time in that support group from them getting the support they need. So this is his rationale, and I just want you to think about, what do you think is happening here, and what, if anything, might you say in response? Okay, thank you for listening.